Well, welcome everyone. Glad to have you all here this afternoon. It is kind of exciting that you're considering to start a business or have already started. I always think that one of the important components here is that it really is critical to sort of get a really good understanding of the pieces of the pie, or as I say, pieces of the puzzle that really make up what is important in relative to the legal components, the branding, the organization, and then all of what all of those pieces bring together. So, want to just kind of give you a quick overview here that this is general information. Um, we here at SBDC Advisors, we are not accountants and we're not attorneys, but we just barely brush on those components and give you as much information as we possibly can. I'm going to start with, I think what Rahul had mentioned, let me see, was the information relative to what SBDCs do. And I surely want to add some additional information to that. Hold on here, there we go. So again, just to reiterate, I am an advisor with the North Metro Small Business Development Center. Have been advising going now on about 17 years. And just a little bit about myself, I am a former educator, or I guess you could say I'm still educating, but was an administrator. I was a principal of a high school, and then of an elementary school. I retired in 2007, and the rest is history. I came out looking for some support and wanted to provide some support for small business owners that were in my school. And I volunteered because I stumbled onto these SBDC services and realized that they're some really, really good services. So, as Raul said, we provide individual consulting one on one. Those are really the heart of what we do. When we talk on these general overview components, we know that every business is different. And so when you get this information, you probably have more questions. And that is why the individual advising is really, really helpful because we dig a little bit deeper, go a little bit dive into more of your business, and we can help you a little bit more. And of course, you know, the leading edge North Metro has is a really good one. That's another more focused, very deep dive kind of services for you. And the resources that we probably bring you are endless in terms of starting a business. We can help you make some contacts and as well as give you, we don't have money, but we can connect you to those of you that are looking for the various different loans. Some of the cities, I know Westminster does have um, some very, very small grant programs. And so there are some opportunities that you have as you work through some of the services that we provide here at the SBDC. We are going to have a discussion, or I am going to talk to you about the legal structure, the registration, the licensing, the permits, and then just basically some components about the financials, a little bit about taxes. As I said, I am not an accountant, but have some general information for you relative to what we can provide. I think it's important to think about your business in the form of how you're going to manage it, some insurance protection, the marketing research that is critical, and then, of course, the really important foundation to your business is really the business plan. And I will go over some of that information. Please do not hesitate. I know that Raul is going to be um, just kind of looking over your questions. And if you have questions, don't hesitate, put them in the chat, and Raul will stop me, and I can definitely answer what I can. and the hour and a half that we have. And even if you want to interrupt me, that's fine too. I'm very open to that system, and we'll have questions at the end as well. One of the things that I think is really important as you begin to think about a business, it is relative important to consider. In fact, are you really focused on a target population? And what is the market that you're really looking for? Most of you, I would say, and in my experience, every time I connect with a startup, we already realize that you have competition. And so, what type of competition do you have, and how intensive is it? That's really important to consider. Do you have the management skills to really focus in on all of the components that are necessary to begin to build upon the foundation of having a good quality business? Remember that when you think about business, it's not that complex because you do have in business the operations, you have the marketing, you have the financial, and you have the components of how you bring in your personal connections to that process. Most of all, small business owners do not have a whole lot of resources. So, what's important is to know how much resources do you have to start the business? Do you have the necessary funds to begin the components, or are you going to truly just bootstrap every phase of your business? This is really important as you begin to think of the success of the business. We are going to start with the legal structures. And I'll probably spend a good part of an hour and a half on these different components and the entities that are going to be critical for you to understand in a general way. There is so much specificity that you can gain once you know what type of entity you're going to be, that it will be important just for you to understand why you are going to be what you're going to be as far as the entity. In the state of Colorado, basically we have five different type of entities. We have the single owner, which is what we call the sole proprietor. There's partnerships, the limited liability company, and then there's an S corp entity and a C corp entity. Most likely, what we will cover in depth, at least today, is going to be the four components of the single, the partner limited, and the S corp. Not much about the C. They are much more larger, very complex, and usually a C corp can be established through an accountant or an attorney because there's many more legal restraints and components that are necessary for those that type of entity. The first type of entity that we'll discuss is going to be the sole proprietorship. There are some great advantages to a sole proprietorship. And so when you think about that entity, it is probably the least complicated of all entities. And in the state of Colorado, anyone who sells a product or a service and gets money for it truly already is a sole proprietor. You don't have to have really a proper name for the business. You do business with your name personally, and you are selling and you're selling your products and services. You are a sole proprietor by the nature of what the um, the statute defines. Profit and loss are reported on your personal tax returns, and so what we call a pass-through tax entity. Therefore, all of the business earnings and the revenue expense components are going to be important to track. But when it's all said and done, at the end of the year, IRS will ask whether you had another way of making money. And so that could be the sole proprietorship. Remember that the sole proprietorship is one person, and that means that all decisions that are controlled by that one individual. And therefore, that's how simple it can be because no one else needs to be um, uh, connected to this business in any way but one person that is the owner. There are some disadvantages, obviously, to the sole proprietorship. Everything that you create in a debt for this business as a sole proprietor belongs to you, the individual, on a personal level. Therefore, anything that is created towards the business debt will also be carried by you, the individual. And it's also very easy to mix personal and business finances. So you have to be really careful how you work the business because usually a sole proprietorship in terms of a bank account can be applied through the personal bank account. And so therein lies the difficulty that it has if you do have a mixing of the two. And commingling can be very, very easy. Sole proprietors are simple in that if you don't have a name for the business, but you're doing business, then you do not have to register the sole proprietorship. As soon as you have the name that is different than your proper name, for example, if I call myself Morning Sun and I'm a sole proprietor, now I have to register that business through the state of Colorado. Partnerships in the state of Colorado, everything that I've said about the sole proprietorship, I am going to echo relative to the partnership. The difference is obviously that there is more than one individual, but it has the same implications. It is a pass-through tax entity. If you don't have a name, say Raul and I start selling products, but we don't have a proper name for the business, we are still a partnership. As soon as we create a name, then we have to register the business. We can use our social securities to actually run the business. And when we make profits, the business will pass through those profits on to us. We can actually, as partners, contribute any components that we want in any different percentages. And so partnerships have some advantages in that um, Raul and I can decide that we're 60-40 or 70-30. So we decide what percentages ownership we want. It's always very difficult if you are going to be a partnership to consider yourself 50-50. You can, but remember that presents a bigger problem in decision making as well. Partners can truly divide their expertise, and therefore, another advantage is that when two partners or three or four come together, as long as they can define the skill level and the skill set of what they're going to do in that business, that is always very helpful. So Raul is great at finances, so he's the boss of finances in our business. I am great at marketing, and so I am going to be the boss in marketing. And therein lies the beauty of a partnership because it has a lot of potential in the skill sets that we have. We can share whatever percentage we have decided and how we are going to work the business. That would be part of the process of defining our profits, as well as how much we put into the business. And if in fact the business does not create a profit, then the same applies that we then define what our losses are on the same percentages as we defined the business for each other. The disadvantages of the partnership are obviously that, uh, as I said, if they're not registered, then that can become very complicated. Once you have a name, then you do have to have a registered name with the Secretary of State. We also have the liability issue, like the sole proprietorship, and every decision that we make together or separately is based on the personal background as of our assets that become also liable as well. If I make a decision that puts Raul in a bad situation of our partnership, then he has to live with that reality. So partnerships really must operate with a very important document, which is called the operating agreement. So that then there is, in fact, the components that address how each of these businesses is going to work relative to our ownership in terms of the percentage of ownership and what responsibilities we have, what happens if one of us passes, what happens if one of us leaves. All of those become really important. And so if you do not have an operating agreement, this is a really huge disadvantage for um, partnerships. The next type of entity is the limited liability company. And here is where I think if anyone is interested in this type of entity, it has much more legal restrictions as well as it provides for some important components that the IRS deems very critical in how it needs to be run. So the comparison of the sole proprietorship partnership to the limited liability company is that this type of entity, you do have to register it and you cannot use your own proper name. I could use Jesse Esparza Services, but I cannot just use Jesse Esparza LLC. So that becomes a very important aspect of what the IRS will consider to be the LLC by having a name that is separate from me personally. It looks like a sole proprietorship, and when you do register the limited liability company, one person becomes a sole member. And so that is the difference between a sole proprietor. The beauty of the limited liability company is that it acts like a corporation. In other words, it separates all of your personal assets from what you are going to do as a business, and it will focus these two components of your personal assets and your business assets as two separate components. It is, in fact, a very independent business into itself. And therefore, an LLC must be registered with the Secretary of State, And the requirements that it must meet is that it must have an employee identification number, which we know as an EIN or an FEIN, as it sometimes is called. The third component is that it must have a separate bank account. So the bank account must be registered under the business name with the FEIN, and therefore it cannot be established with your Social Security like the sole proprietorship and the partnership. The fourth component is that the IRS requires that you assemble your structure with the understanding of a financial organizational system that will give them the ability to know that you will be paying estimated taxes if applicable. So that means that you probably will be setting up this LLC with your financials on a monthly basis so that every month you can determine what your revenue was, what your expenditures were, and at the end of that quarter, you will determine whether you have profits. And if you have a set number of profits over which the IRS considers to be over $1,000, then you would need to um, do the estimated taxes on that business. So those are really the important components in terms of the limited liability company. As you can begin to see, they have a little bit more restrictions and they're a little bit different than the sole proprietorship and the partnership. The beauty of the limited liability company, as opposed to a, a partnership, is that we can actually create partnerships inside limited liability companies. So, for example, Raul and I could also just be a limited liability partnership instead of a regular partnership. As we begin to focus on these components, then we would follow the guidelines that we talked earlier. We can have an operating agreement, and in that operating agreement, we can create a 60-40, 70-30, 51-49. And so that gives us a little bit more credibility and establishes a better foundation because it separates all the personal strictly and creates it into the business entity.
There is a question, Jesse.
Mhm.
Can I change legal structure later on?
You can change legal structures. Of course, when we get to that part, I can tell you that there are fees that are going to be charged for every time you dissolve or you transition from one entity to another. Also, there are some guidelines that if an entity is switching from, say, an LLC to a corporation, there are some restrictions as to when you can do that as well. So, but yes, you can. An LLC requires the articles of organization. So basically, this is a document that defines the difference between a sole proprietorship and the LLC. In an LLC, you cannot mix personal finances with business finances. And this is really important because commingling is one of the components that can be very dangerous to a limited liability company. So, in other words, take the example that I start the limited liability company. I started this company yesterday. I registered it. I got my federal EIN, and now I am Morning Sun. So tomorrow, I plan on going in and buying a computer. But I have to be careful because if I use my personal credit card for purchasing that computer, now that I'm a business and registered with an EIN and a bank account, now that means I would be commingling. So I now have to use just business money to do whatever I'm going to purchase with for the business on any expenditure that the business is going to have. Very important. Otherwise, then I am commingling. And the other component that is interesting here is that then you are liable then to actually just be a sole proprietor. So you move your what you have intended to be a limited liability company back to a sole proprietor just by the commingling of what you've done. So that's why, the LLC has the beauty of it all is that it combines the concepts of the sole proprietorship and the partnership, and it does much more than those two entities together. Now, there are some disadvantages to the limited liability company. So remember that it is treated and recognized throughout the United States. However, it is not an international entity. In other words, it is a U.S. entity. When you start doing maybe the international trade, that could be a little bit more sticky, and you have to definitely get uh, more information on how that process needs to work with an LLC. As we said, you cannot mix personal finances with business. And it could get expensive because if I am a sole member, then really it's not as difficult. But as soon as I bring in and we start doing partnerships, LLCs, Raul and I might not be that difficult. Maybe three or four or five of us are partnerships. It could get very expensive because you probably want an attorney or an accountant to work through those components of all of the documents of how this uh, LLC is going to be effective to each of its um, owners. And remember, the other disadvantage is that if you do not meet the IRS requirements, um, just remember that any business, whether it be a sole proprietor, partnership, LLC, S Corp, C Corp, there are the realities that someday you will get audited. And so these are important aspects that when you do get audited, if you are commingling and or if you're not meeting the IRS requirements, it could cost you. So I'll stop there. Any questions on the LLC? Usually that seems to be that brings up, you know, more questions than any other entity. So I'll give a chance if there is.
Yeah, there's a couple questions in the chat. Um, what if your only income is from the business? How do you separate personal and business income?
Don't quite understand the question. If all your business comes from the business, I'm thinking you're asking how do you get paid? And if that's a question, that's a good question. In that, um, if you are making revenue from, say, an LLC or any of the businesses, there are components that you can pay yourself. Sole proprietors can pay themselves just by withdrawing money out of the business. Partnerships doing the same thing, limited liability companies the same way. So you make money through the business and you pay yourself personally by withdrawing money out of the business into your personal bank account. Hope that answered that question.
Right. If I already have some materials for the business, like a computer, is it okay to donate it to the business, or am I better off just purchasing a new computer to solely use for business?
You could donate, yes, if you um, have the ability then just to understand all of, some of those components. I would say, connecting with the bookkeeper, an accountant, if you have the numbers, serial numbers, everything, and you're donating all of that with the pricing, the going price of that computer, as it as it's um, states at the time, yeah, you can donate that to the business, and then those items become part of the business um, balance sheet.
Awesome. There is another question. When a business starts out and I use personal funds, does that count as commingling of funds?
When the business starts out, this is an important question. I'm hoping I can answer it by the way you're asking it. Um, y- the the one thing that you can do uh, with a limited liability company is that if you purchase the entity of the limited liability company, you can use your personal credit card that one time. Then that becomes the business. Now you have to use business money. So we always recommend that if you need to purchase and you do not have any any business already coming in, revenue, then what you could do basically, you can become the lender. You can lend the business, some money, and you put it in the bank account of the business, and then that becomes a loan. And there's ways that you can track that. The IRS says that basically you can generate capital through your personal assets, or you can lend the business money, depending on how that works. And an accountant will work with you on how to document those components so that you can still purchase items with the business money that actually could come from your pocket, but put into the bank account of the business first.
Great. There's another question. What about certifications and professional development? Would that count as something the business needs to pay for?
It could, of course, yeah. Anything that probably I would say an accountant would say anything that is connected to doing business is part of business, and so that definitely, to be strictly answered correctly, would be an accountant answer, an accountant question that you've got to ask. But yeah, I would say anything you do in business, like professional development, is probably a business expense.
That's all the questions in the
Okay.
chat for now.
Okay. The next type of entities are corporations, and in this case, mostly talking about S corporations. And remember that these become a little bit different, more complicated. Corporations are different than the limited liability company in that the corporation will need the article of incorporation, not organization. So those are two very distinct, different articles, and have to be established through the Secretary of State as well. It is always important to obtain at least counsel through an attorney or an accountant, because corporations are different in that rather than ownership by member, it is really ownership by the number of shares that you own. So again, shareholders are the individuals that own portions of the corporation or all of it. And so this is really the different type of focus on ownership. The one type of corporation is the S corporation. You must have a set of bylaws if you are going to be a corporation, and you must have a set of board of directors. You can start with, two people, three people, four people, five people. It depends on how big you want, the board of directors to be. And again, they will be all based, these individuals are regulated by the bylaws that are created for the corporation. S corporations are much more regulated just by the mere existence of how they contribute within, say, the tax liability and what tax advantages that they obtain that S corp the um, liabilities don't have, or sole proprietors. So there are probably more incentives that corporations get through cities than some of the other type of entities, and therefore they are much more regulated.
There is a question. Can an S corp be for one owner businesses or only if there are multiple individual owners?
No, in the state of Colorado, one person can be um, the main shareholder, and they also can solicit to be the set up the bylaws as well as be the board of directors. There are some kind of interesting uh, components to the S corp in that you literally can create an S corp and be a pass-through tax entity as an LLC. Again, something to consider as you begin to build your business. There are different ways to set up S corps, but again, I'd say consult an accountant or an attorney to give you the best advantage as to how you're going to set it up. It also will apply into the, um, I think, the um, important questions of the type of product or services you're going to provide. If it's something that could be dangerous to populations, such as a chemical business of some sort, those are even more important to work through attorneys and um, accountants, especially as corporations. Remember that all of these entities, which we have gone through this afternoon, they will all have some tax um, liability issues, and you want to consider each of these entities based on what tax advantages are you looking for and what tax liabilities are you preparing yourself for. So it is important to talk to a tax advisor. Remember that the liability issue is something that's important to consider. Um, the sole proprietorship has very, very limited liability protection, and so neither does the partnership. But the limited liability has a little bit more protection, and then of course the S corp and the C corp even have more. When you're thinking about protection, the reason that the S corps and C corps have much more protection is because they are entities that are private, and therefore their disclosures have different regulations than, say, the liability and or the sole proprietorship and the partnership. So something to really think about in terms of what advantages are you looking for in terms of these components of liability, taxes, that you want to prepare yourself for. It's important to really get all of the documents prepared because if in fact you are going to transition from one entity to the other, those documents are going to be important because the validity of these documents are based on what the what other entity you're going to move towards. So those would really be important to keep in consideration how whether you have them or not. One example is the EIN. Um, Nowadays, you do not get any formal letters, documents that are sent to you for your federal EIN. So you have to keep a good record of that because it's all sent through email. And and if you're transitioning, then you also have to transition the EIN from one entity to the other as well through forms, as an example. Okay, well, before we go, is there any questions on entities before we go to the next level? That's all I'm going to say about this these entities. There is much more, believe me, but due to time and giving you as much general information and overview of the entities, is there any other questions before I move to the next steps?
Yeah, there's a couple more questions. So do we have a list of referrals for us to seek legal help with?
No. I think I would say that, the North Metro does have at least some advisors that are as an attorney, I think, and maybe an accountant, but nothing that's real specific. I think you have to really pursue that with, individuals that you have already some experience with and have um, been advised or have been retained with those individuals.
And there's a comment, I like having an LLC. It provides some protections, keeps the business separate from my personal accounts, keeps taxes easier, can file at one time each year. Um, Also, per his notes, it looks like the S Corp requires a board of directors.
Yes, you have to have a board of directors. As we said earlier, one person can be the entire board.
And that's it for now.
Okay. Okay, so let's move over to the next step, and that is how do you register and what are the components? Once you have selected the type of entity that you're going to be, excuse me, to me, that's the very first and most important decision that you want to make because once you've made the decision of the type of entity you're going to be, the name of the entity, then you can move towards the registration process. And that would be through the Secretary of State. So if you are a sole proprietor, partnership, LLC, any of those S Corp, you can and will be required to register if you're going to have a name of a business through the Secretary of State. As we know it, the DBA or the sole proprietor is going to cost you $25. And the partnership is going to cost you $25. It's also a DBA, sole proprietorship partnership. The limited liability company is going to cost you $50, and so is the corporation. Once you register the business, you basically will make sure that the name does not exist because there can only be one name that Colorado allows as a registered name. So, in other words, for example, Morning Sun LLC can only be one owner or one person owning that. There cannot be another person owning Morning Sun LLC. There could be another person owning Morning Sun trade name, DBA. There could be another person owning Morning Sun corporation. So that is important to understand when you register the name, that your business name of that entity is the only one that can exist. The second step in this order is then you can register and obtain an EIN with the IRS. This one is free, so you do not have to pay anything for the FEIN, and it's done all online, and it's received all online as well. Another thing to remember about this little component here is that it's really important when and if you are going to register to obtain the EIN, that you go to the irs.gov. If you should by chance put in FEIN in Google, then what attaches to that is you're going to get 3 or 4 companies that are going to sell you an EIN for $150, $200. So you got to be careful that you do not have to pay anything for the federal employee identification number.
Jesse, we do have a question.
Hmm?
If I have any registered LLC and do contract work or as a vendor, how should I complete the W-9?
Yeah, question again, I'm sorry.
Yeah, so they're asking about if they have a registered LLC and they do contract work or as a vendor, how should I complete the W-9?
Okay, I don't know how to answer that because I'm not an accountant. What I will answer with is that if you are already a business name and you are registered, then basically what what you need to understand is that you're contracting as a business. And the W-9 is going to be important that you put down the business name and your EIN. That's the closest I can help with that process. Any other questions, Robert?
Not right now.
Okay.
Oh, actually, one just popped up. So if I accidentally one second. If I accidentally registered 2 EIN numbers with my one business, how do I rectify this with the IRS?
If you go to the irs.gov and you put in the search engine EIN um, publish publications, there are forms that you can download to rectify any mistakes that you make with your EIN, or to change the name of the business um, with your EIN, or change the EIN to another business. So you go and download the proper form and you send it in to the IRS.
Okay. No more questions as of right now.
Okay. The third step is important then for you to obtain the bank account, and in this order as well. What's going to happen in the process of you starting the business is that you've got to register the business. You've got then the name of the business, and you've got the Secretary of State information. You have the federal employee identification number, and then the bank is going to ask you if you are a limited liability company, that they want to see that you've got the Secretary of State registration process. And then they want to see the EIN, and then they will register your business with that bank. You do not remember, you do not have to have an EIN with a sole proprietorship or a partnership. We advise that you do anyway. But with the Social Security, you can get a bank account if you are a sole proprietor and or a partnership. The fourth step is really the important components now begin to work their way into the state of Colorado and into the cities. So probably a good process for you to utilize would be My Biz Colorado, and they will provide you with directions on how to register your business for a sales tax number for the state of Colorado, and they will help you to also determine, what you're going to need to do for the process of the taxation component. That is going to be important. If you are a product oriented business, then you must have a sales tax number, and it got to be ob- obtained through the state of Colorado.gov.
There is a question, just to clarify, if we are selling intangible digital products, we don't need a sales tax license?
Well, my friend, that sounds like an oxymoron. If you are selling tangible, that's not. I mean, if it's tangible, meaning if you can touch it, then you have to obtain a sales tax. But if it's online, if it's digital and it's from computer to computer, that's probably not a what we. I don't think it would be considered to be a tangible product.
Another question, is the process of registering an LLC with the Secretary of State the same thing as creating article of organization? Or are these two different processes, documents?
It's the same process when you register to to your business to obtain the LLC. The document that you are obtaining through that registration is the article of organization. It's part of the document that is completed in the process. Good question. All right. So then we're looking at the other important components, and that is that your city, the city of Westminster, is going to require you to register your business at the city, and you can do it by obtaining the form online. Westminster has a you go to the City of Westminster, you go to the uh, business section, and you can download the form to register your business license. The other part to this is that you also then, through the city, will need to obtain a sales tax license. And here is where it gets a little bit complicated in the whole concept of taxation. There are cities that are home rule cities, and they have done all of the work for their statute to be set up that the city collects the city's tax. And therefore, you have to send your, if you're a product business, you have to send the state its sales tax for the state. And then you have to also send the city their tax for the city tax of the product that you're selling. And then there's other small tax um, responsibilities, and the state will give you that information, and so will the city, as to whether there are other um, minor tax liabilities that you have to take care of within each of those components.
Okay, we've got a few more questions popping up here. Is the business license related to your certificate of good standing?
No, it isn't. The business license is a um, is a responsibility that you have to obtaining it through the cities. You obtain a business license through your city. The um, the good standing document you obtain through the Secretary of State.
And another question, if you're selling services, not products, must you get a business license from the city?
Good question. That was my next um, information to you all. Another little complexity is that even though you are not, I might cover this since the question is here. I'll go ahead and answer it here. Even though you are a service-oriented business, you still may need to register and obtain a city um, sales tax license because there's another type of tax that's called a a use tax. And so every business that is in business, whether they are a product oriented or a service oriented business, has to understand that if they purchase any products that they use for their business, say a computer, and you do not pay taxes on that item, then you still owe the tax to the city. So an example would be that I I go to Office Max and I buy a $2,000 computer. And one of the beauties of being a business to business is that we don't have to collect taxes from each other. And so the Office Max um, clerk says, "Your business, yes, here's my ID number." And so $2,000, 8.5 cents, um, whatever that price is, I don't pay it. But I have to use that computer for my business. And because I'm using that computer for my business, then I owe the use tax to my city. And therein lies, at some point, you will be required to pay the city the portion of what they require back to the city on that item. Gets a little complicated, but that's, I would say, is a important aspect to whether you are a service or a product oriented business. You still have to pay at least some form of tax.
That's awesome. So we do have a few more questions. This is some great questions coming up. Where do I learn whether my city is a home rule city?
There is a great publication. If you go to My Biz Colorado, um, they have a nice publication on any tax question you have, and one of those answers is they have a list of all the home rule cities in the state of Colorado. So we just go into the IRS, Colorado IRS, and obtain that information. I think, and even most cities will have that information. They'll let you know whether they are a home rule city and whether they are collecting taxes of their own.
Um, Another question. I have not registered my business in the city yet, only the state. Should I go ahead and register it now? I offer coaching and courses, not products.
Yes, even if you're not a product oriented business, all businesses um, must register in their city in the front range. There are some cities that don't require a business license, but definitely you got to check with your city to determine if in fact need to obtain a business license. I would say most cities on the Front Range require a business license.
Yes, many do. Broomfield is one that doesn't.
Yeah.
Um, a comment, really interesting comment. We had difficulty with the use tax form. It would not let us show where we already paid taxes on those purchases. So we just paid again because it was very frustrating. Jesse, do you know of any resources that might be helpful for those that are filling out forms like that?
There's actually, I think that the state and some cities on YouTube have already put their information on the procedures and how to fill out the forms. And I think YouTube has some updated information. What I usually do is I'll check in to YouTube channels to see if how updated they are. The other thing is that the cities also have some really good videos that they provide online for individuals to look at how to fill out those forms. So that's another resource that I think can be well, utilized. And then, probably the third one is just to contact the city and also the state IRS office. And there are individuals that will help to help people complete the forms correctly. Remember, they want their money, right? So they do really help out for you to do the right forms and turn them in at the right time at the right, places.
Perfect. Um, and then yeah, one trying to get a little more clarity around the earlier question regarding digital project products.
Uh,
Um, so they're saying they're a bit confused because they're referring to selling services and trainings,
uh-huh.
or permanent products like maybe like a course. So there would be like a digital asset, but not necessarily uh, as the state defines a digital product, it might be a little bit different. Is that something that they can reach out for some one-on-one advising, probably to go a little deeper into?
Yep, definitely. Definitely. And,
Okay,
and I would say that probably, again, if it's a real kind of in the gray area, I would say that's a good time then to also contact the state tax office, and they will definitely give a good answer to those kinds of questions.
perfect. That's it for now.
Okay. So just to kind of complete this component, I want to just also just give you the overview that there are other type of permits, of course, that you have to be at least cognizant of in terms of what your responsibilities are. So if you're in the process of providing any kind of edible um, of selling edible items, then it's really worth you checking with the health department to make sure that that edible product. Now, there are the cottage laws, and the state has some limitations that you can sell some edibles without going through all of the red tape with the county health department. And so it is really important that at least you check in, get some advice as to whether that item that you're selling, if it's going to be an edible, is required for going through the permits and all of the health department requirements. Also, if you are selling for sure any meat or vegetables, remember that they activate bacteria, and that is why then the health department requires commercial kitchen permits and you working with commercial kitchens when you're selling um, the products that contain those kinds of ingredients. Also, make sure that you're checking in with the city for any kind of inspections. If you have a brick and mortar, you're going to have to be dealing with those kinds of inspections. Fire departments are very important, to be able to connect with as well. And always, just as advice, it's good to go to the website and be able to just check in the city to make sure that what you're selling has legitimacy relative to what some of the requirements and the codes are in that process of the the business. Another agency that is really important, many of you who are starting businesses as accountants, as beauty salons, hairdressers, dentists, all of these, DORA is a regulatory agency that will require a license and the registration of your business license through them. So another important component is to at least check in with the Department of Regulatory Agency. So all you got to do is in the search engine, you can put all capitals DORA, and it's going to take you straight to that regulatory agency, and it gives you information as to whether it would require, based on the type of business that you are, the regulations.
Yes, so we do have a question. What cosmetics do we need to get a commercial license?
What cosmetics? Can we ask just a bit more clarity on
Yeah,
that?
sorry, that did not come across right on my talk to text at all. My question was like I do cosmetics and lotions and things like that. So when you were talking about having a commercial kitchen, do you need to obtain a commercial kitchen license to do those products as well?
I don't think so, but since you just asked that, Ashley, it's good to go to Dora. For that one, I'd say go to Dora because you're selling, items. And the reason that beauty salons do have that regulation is because they sell some of those kinds of products. So it's worth going to Dora to see what requirements you would have when you're selling those type of products. Okay. Okay. So now, moving a little bit more into a little bit of the organizational components, since we have about probably 20 minutes here, I want to just move through these because these are as important. Management is really an important aspect of business. And when you think in terms of how you're going to do business, most of you are going to be operators. Most of you are going to focus on selling your product. Management is many times overlooked, but really it's the process of planning and making sure that you're keeping good records, making sure that you actually are defining the products and their costs and how much does a product cost versus how much you're selling it for, and then analyzing all those different situations. So think about management as a separate, very important component that has to be addressed in order for you to have that piece of the puzzle be successful in what you're doing in business. When you're actually maintaining and you're organizing the business, there's really two different components. The maintenance obviously comes day to day, and the organization is part of how you're going to create that good maintenance program. So making sure that you've got some good um, understanding of the state and federal regulations, local regulations that exist, making sure that you're not is creating your business without those understandings because again, you get fined, then it's too late. It's always something that you wished you would have backtracked a little bit better to make sure that you understood what those regulations were of that city or of the state. Remember that the business is always changing. As you're growing the business, it's also changing. And so the decision making that you're making and that you're doing consistently is going to be at the forefront of the business. And so it really is important that you continue to get information, um, especially if you're gonna that's supposed to say loan. So if you're going to get a loan, if you're going to make changes, something like that, it's important to really keep the information of the business up to date. Maintenance and organization is really all about system developments. It's about saving your receipts. It's about making sure that you're paying your income taxes or making sure that you're collecting the money for the income taxes, making sure that you're developing good expenses and making sure that you're doing it on a monthly basis, especially if you are an LLC. Remember, you you want to keep it in regulation of what you're supposed to be expending and doing it in case that you would have to pay, say, something like an estimated tax. It's a good thing as a business and especially as a startup to get into a good habit of establishing at least a budget for your business. Understand that to have a business be successful, you have to have a good concept of how you're going to manage cash flow in this business. And cash flow really is the essence of your business. Cash flow is really the part that will define whether you have the ability to pay your expenses next month. And many times you may be doing well in business, but your payments aren't coming in time. But is that then the ability for you to have cash flow or not having the ability to have cash flow? So very important. That's why establishing a budget can really be helpful. Keep a good focus on your monthly finances as that will help your business continue to grow and also help you make decisions about how to use what could be considered profit or additional expenses to grow your business. I like to start at the very bottom first to explain to you that cash flow is really the important part of growing a business and the ability for you to have the month to month operations of the business. So it's really cash flow says, I have enough revenue to pay this month's bills. Income statements are a little bit different because they give you information about not only the revenue and expenses, but also whether in fact you had a profit that month or in fact you had a loss that month. And it also will tell you and give you information about if in fact you have the responsibility of having to pay a tax that month to the IRS or to the state. And then, of course, the balance sheet gives you a snapshot of information about the worth of your business. And so, really, when you think about a balance sheet, it has the implications like a home. When you are paying mortgage to your home, and after 2, 3 years, that home has equity. Well, the same concept is, and it relates to the same with the balance sheet. Balance sheet will tell you what value your business has or has acquired through time. Just generally, as we've already talked a little bit about this, that the sales tax license is really important. So if you sell, rent, or lease any um, uh, tangible personal property in Colorado, then you're going to need a sales tax license. The Colorado retail license is basically the same um, item as the sales tax license. So one item that I think individuals sometimes forget is that if you're renting a space, then you're going to be paying sales tax. If you're leasing a space, then you're also going to be um, defining that as a taxable item as well. The wholesale license is if you're doing business to business, as we discussed earlier, then you have the ability to not have to pay taxes business to business. But until you resell it to the end user, then that taxes becomes uh, necessary to collect. These are really good resources for the federal tax information for those of you that are starting the business or have already started. This is a good, if you then just go to the irs.gov and deducting business expenses, there's a publication for that. There's also a publication if you put in IRS home office deductions, there's a publication for that. And then there's also a publication for those of you that need to understand a little bit more on how to pay your estimated taxes. Because remember, estimated taxes are not business taxes, they're your tax. In other words, LLCs are a pass through tax, sole proprietors are pass through tax, and in partnerships are a pass-through tax. So you're the one that's paying the estimated tax. And there's forms and publications on how to do that. And then, of course, you also have a lot of really good information about how to run your business out of your home, which many of you are going to do. When it comes to insurance, we say you don't need to over-insure yourself, but be careful about under-insuring yourself. There's a lot of different types of insurance protection opportunities. And so you could over-insure yourself. It's really important for you to connect with an insurance agent, get some recommendations of what you need to purchase initially, and then build on as you grow your business. A lot of additional insurance opportunities exist and important necessary insurance requirements exist. The business liability insurance is probably not a requirement in the state of Colorado, but a high, you know, at least probability you should have. Completed operation insurance. There's again other types of insurances. If you're going to be, having being a contractor, you might be looking at other different kinds of insurance as a contractor and not a product. There are just the different necessities based on the business that you are and the products you sell or the service. So important to really check with an insurance agent. Just a little bit about market research. Remember that what's important here in the process of starting a business is for you to be sure that you're focusing your dollar to the target population that you are trying to sell to. So it's important to ask the questions: who are your customers? What is it that's motivating them to buy what you have? Remember, we already discussed that most of you already have competition, and therefore you want to be setting your business with an added value to what you have to offer. So, what are the benefits that customers are going to get for what you sell? And what size of market are you looking at? Are you expanding? Are you looking at nationally? Is it social media? Is it local, direct? What is it? And who are your competitors in terms of that business that you have? There may be competitors out there, but they're way beyond what you can compete with, and therefore they may not be your competitors. So consider what is your individual or a business that can be considered to be your competitor. Important components to consider when you're doing um, marketing is what are your strengths and weaknesses. Very important towards what you're selling as you begin the process. Look up a variety of different agencies, different resources, chambers, Department of Commerce and the Census Bureau. Um, I would really recommend that anybody starting a business connect to some of these resources to get information about your potential customer, your target population, the cities where you reside, where you're going to have your business. Most of them will have demographic information. Public libraries have it, and also universities and colleges. And finally, the business plan. Remember that, again, as we discussed, all of these different components are different pieces of the puzzle. And so a good entrepreneur owner is at least going to look at the goals that they have for the business, where they want to be in 6 months, where they want to be in a year. And so you want to be able to devise a process of how you're going to get there through a very, very, basic business plan. And so you want to, in the business plan, be able to recognize how you're going to market, how you're going to manage, how you're going to establish your financial projections to the actuals and the outcomes, and then how you're going to operate the business. These are really important pieces of the puzzle to help you actually get to where you're going. And a good business plan doesn't have to be 50 pages. I always say, if you have in your startup, you have the mission statement, you have your values, you have your goals for 1 year and your objectives that you are wanting to accomplish, and your business description makes up at least a good document that you're going to follow for 1 year, because businesses will grow. And so this business plan is not going to be um, be standing still for 1 year. You're probably going to make changes. And if things aren't going well, you're going to go back and redefine some of the components of marketing, some of the components of management, of financial, of operation. So it's constantly changing, and it's going to keep you focused to get what you have considered to be, the outcome that you want. Remember that in a business plan, you have these components of the facilities, you have the equipment, materials, the fees, any other costs that maybe not categorized under any of these. You also want to also figure out how you're going to deal with your profits. Remember that a profit is only profit if you have made the decision to take it out and it becomes outside the realm of your expenses. But how businesses grow is that instead of profits, and if you don't need that money, profit is meaning that you're going to have to pay taxes on it. Well, if you use it to grow the business, then it's not going to be profit. And so there's some decisions that a business plan can help you make in terms of the income and the expenses that you're going to create. So keep those very important aspects of the process of this direction there, or where you're going through the business plan. Quickly, if you are going to obtain a loan, then most lenders are going to want what they call a pro forma business plan. So pro forma means that it has at least 3 years of financial projections, of the cash flow projections, profit and loss projections, and the balance sheet. And so that is important to the lender because they want to know how you're going to pay them back, and what it is that they can be assured that you're not going to go under. So that's important to a lender, and that's why they would want something a little bit more than just a very basic action plan. Overall, it's important. Just minimize your risks. How do you do that? Well, expand your knowledge. Glad you're all here. This is good. This is a good beginning. And at least maybe for some, it's a review. What did you miss out? For those that you starting up, it's a good foundation of what you need to understand. And there's going to be more. Keep planning. Plan, plan, plan. Do not, just operate, but go into the process of actually planning to be successful and not just work that business. Get support and help. Be prepared to work. It's going to take, some effort. Not easy. Leverage your strengths. What are your strengths? Be honest with yourself. Look at what are those strengths that you have that will help you, and what are those weaknesses that you have that you're going to need support on. And then, of course, I always say, establish an action plan or a business plan that will give you guidance of where you're going. We know businesses fail, right? I keep this number at my side when I work with one-on-one startups, and I remind them about 90% of all startups die the first year. And so what do you do to not let this business die? Well, you have to make sure you have insufficient capital. Make sure that you really work on all the business planning process so it doesn't just give you poor business planning. Make sure that you look at the performances that are against you. Make sure that there's not a lack of management, adequate cost control. Keep that accounting system going and identify the competition so that you can compete with them as you work through growing the business. Okay, my friends, we are at the end. Can you imagine?
Wow. Thank you, Jesse. That was awesome. Really quick before we go into more questions, I put in the chat a link for those that have not registered for advising before. That link is just a general has a couple of different options there when you go there. If you're brand new, there's a box that says new client. Just click that, and then it'll take you through a process of getting started with registering for advising. If you've done advising before, you can click the other one. And if you know who your home center is and you know it's with North Metro, you can always reach out to me or through email, northmetro.spdc@frontrange.edu. I'll put that down as well. And we can connect you with like a specific type of advisor if you're looking for something specific. Okay, but if you haven't done advising yet, you're going to want to get started with the lead advisor. Jesse's a lead advisor, and he's also speaks in Spanish if anybody needs assistance there, and that'd be preferable. We did have one question, real quick question here. Can you go to the last slide, Jesse? Somebody wants to see that. And then I missed earlier a financial question that came up, and they're basically asking, let me find it. Where did it go? I'm trying to learn about all of the components that should be on a balance sheet. Is this usually just an Excel sheet we create ourselves? Is there a good example online or an easy template to get started?
Yeah, we have those templates. Just you can set up a one-on-one with me. I've got templates for balance sheets. I have templates for cash flow statements, for profit and loss statements, for projections. All those these days, you don't have to create them. They're all done for you. So, yep, we have them and can really be helpful to you.
Awesome. Thank you. Another question, will the slide deck be made available to us?
If Raul can send it out, then of course.
Yes. Yes, I'm going to be sending a follow-up email with the recording and audio transcript as well as the slides. Y'all have any other questions? If you don't have any further questions right now, we'll go ahead and end it for today. I want to thank you again, Jesse. That was amazing. And thank you all for being here. And again, just reach out if you have any questions, and we're happy to help.
Thank you for putting this on. That was really great.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks for being here. Hopefully we'll see some of you on a one-on-one session. All right.